你好，我是天下杂志出版总编辑吴韵仪，欢迎你收听管理同学会。如果你也关心财经的话题的话，我相信你一定知道晶片战争是一个热门的话题。在这段时间，你一定看过关于晶片战争的很多的报道，还有很多的分享。而在这很多的讨论当中，其实呢都是跟最近的一本畅销书《晶片战争 Chip War》是有关的。我在之前的管理同学会当中也曾经邀请到天下杂志的总主笔陈良荣一起来谈《晶片战争》这本书。那今天呢，我要再一次的谈《晶片战争》这本书，因为我很难得的邀请到了作者 Chris Miller 他来上节目，请他自己来介绍他的畅销书《晶片战争》。也许有朋友是第一次加入管理同学会，我还是很快的先介绍一下《晶片战争》跟 Chris Miller。晶片战争是在2022年第4季，美国祭出了晶片法案之后呢，出版上市的。它一出版呢，就受到了很大的关注。它不但登上了纽约时报的畅销书排行榜，也是金融时报年度最佳商业书，也是经济学人在2022年的年度选书。在台湾呢，晶片战争从上市以来，也是每天都在畅销书的排行榜上。所以啊，Chris Miller 他的名字啊，一下子就跟晶片紧紧的连在一起。但其实呢 Chris Miller 他其实本身完全不是来自于科技产业，他是一位历史学者。Chris Miller 他是耶鲁大学的历史博士，现在呢是在美国 Tufts 塔夫兹大学的 Fletcher 学院教授 International History， 他尤其擅长的是美苏之间的关系。那 Chris Miller 他在出版晶片战争之前呢，其实已经写过3本研究俄罗斯的书，而他也是从研究美苏的冷战开始，才发现原来冷战决胜的关键是在晶片。他也从那个时候开始对晶片产生了兴趣，而有了《晶片战争》这本书。Dr. Miller 他在3月的时候来到台湾，这是他第一次访问台湾。我们在他满满的行程当中，特别请他抽出了一点时间，来到管理同学会的 podcast， 自己来谈谈他的书，请他用面对一般读者的角度来告诉我们《晶片战争》这本书为什么值得我们每一个人来阅读。Hi, Chris, thank you for joining my podcast. So let's talk about your book, your bestseller book, Chip War. I would like to start with more general questions. For the general audience, I have to say you have done a great job to make this very complex problem chip industry very accessible to the general readers. Layperson like me without any technology background, I can enjoy it and enjoy it a lot. So in Taiwan, most of us are a little bit familiar with the chip industry. We know the company name and we know the stock price. We love to talk about that. But when I read your book, I see things differently. Yeah, and it seems that you have a different framework to analyze the dynamic of the chip industry. I think you have a certain framework in your mind. And so would you share with us what's your framework to analyze the chip industry and why this framework?
Well, when I started writing the book, I wanted to understand not only where it was today, but also how it had developed over time. And so the first thing I tried to do was look at the history of the industry. And what you find is that the history has been shaped by lots of different companies in different countries, developing different types of technologies. And understanding how that has changed over time, to me, was very insightful in shedding light on how the industry is structured today and why it came to be that way. So that's the first aspect that I tried to bring out in the book, was to explain where all this came from. The second aspect was to look at the intersection between the technology, the business, and the politics. And what I found is that all three of those factors were important from the earliest days up to the present. And you can't really understand any given company today or any given product without looking at how each of those three factors has interacted. And I think it's challenging because it's very rare that you find good analyses of each of those three things simultaneously. There's great books that are written on how the technology has evolved. There's great business journalism, for example, on the business models of the companies. But actually, you need to put all three of those together to really understand how the industry's changed over time. And that's what the book tries to do, is to lay out each of those three facets and to trace the evolution over the past 70 years and how it's led to the success of certain companies, the failure of other companies, and the interaction of those three in the entire industry.
Mm-hmm. So basically, the three important pillars are the technology, business, and politics.
That's right.
Yeah, especially geopolitics. But you're right. Yeah, it's rare to find the information about put them three all together. So how you find the three things have to combine together?
Well, I started looking at the way the industry had developed, and I realized I couldn't understand key turning points without looking at all three. So if you go back to the earliest days of the industry, the first chips emerged in missile guidance systems. And so today we think of chips in smartphones or PCs, but at the earliest days, it was really defense concerns that drove the invention of the technology itself. And that's a political story in large part, because had there not been the geopolitical competition, you wouldn't have had the need for missile guidance systems in the first place. But of course, today, chips are in everything, not just missile systems. And so you need to understand how the business models changed and how companies tried to take this very niche product at first, very expensive product, and turn it into something that could be mass marketed to go into phones and PCs and everything else we use. And that was a business shift, that you had really visionary business people that understood how to make something cheaper and more accessible for the mass market. And that was only possible because the technology was shifting too. Because it's one thing to have a vision of shrinking transistors and putting lots of them in devices, but you need to be able to actually develop the tools that make that possible. And so there's this constant interaction of these three factors from the earliest days. And what I found is that as I traced the key shifts in the industry, the rise of different companies or different countries, you had to understand the interaction of each of those three factors to shape the rise of the companies that came to define the industry.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's why this your book is so interesting and fascinating. And you also include the histories and many anecdotes in your book. And I think that is one of the reasons your book is so accessible to the general audience. And I actually learned that from the stories. I like the stories attracting people. So would you share with us one or two stories that enlightens you during your research and the writing?
Well, one of the individuals that I found was the most fun was Bob Noyce, who was one of the founders of Fairchild Semiconductor and one of the first two people to invent the first integrated circuits. And he was someone who was a brilliant scientist, trained at MIT, where he got a PhD in physics. But actually, his real skill was in thinking about product design. There were a lot of smart physicists in the industry in the early days, but he was the person who realized that if you were able to mass produce chips and drive down their costs, you could put them in all sorts of different products. And at the time, that was a crazy idea. It seemed wild to think that a device that was made for missile systems, that was very expensive, very complex, could be mass marketed to the entire world and put not only in missile systems, but in corporate computers and in pocket calculators and many other types of devices in the 1960s and 70s. But he had that vision, not just of the ways the technology was going to change, but the ways changes in technology could enable entirely new types of products. And to me, that creativity was extraordinary because it required seeing into the future beyond just the way the technology would shift to the way it would impact society. And that's, I realized that that's something that differentiated the real visionary business people from their peers, that they were able to look into the future and see things that no one else could see. And he had a personality, I think, that brought out that type of skill. He was someone who everyone around him said was extraordinarily charismatic. They all wanted to work with him, and they respected him both because he was technically capable in terms of his physics capabilities, but even more than that, everyone sort of had a sense that he was seeing further into the future than everyone else around him. And that really stuck with me as as an important piece of evidence as to what makes a really great business person, someone who can think about the products that no one else can even envision. And so there were people like Noyce who I think had the personality that illustrated really interesting dynamics of what makes a successful business person. I think the other character who stands out in the book is Morris Chang, who of course is well known to your listeners. But what I was surprised by is it's known, I think, to a pretty substantial extent, his founding of TSMC and the success of that company since the founding. I was fascinated to discover the early history of his career. Of course, he studied in the U.S. and then worked at Texas Instruments in Texas for almost 3 decades before founding TSMC. And it was, I think, fascinating to me to understand how that career developed over time and the ideas that led him to found TSMC. And here, too, it was a story not just of technical brilliance, and certainly he was trained at MIT and Stanford, but also the ability to apply that to business models. Because the foundry business model that has defined TSMC since its creation is something that he had developed a decade before actually setting up TSMC. And it was an innovation not in transistor design or in technology per se. It was understanding technological shifts and then applying them to the business model. And to me, that too is a striking illustration of that. The really influential technologists are not just people who think about technology, but they think about business models, they think about product design as well. And so when we think of technology today, I think it's critical to recognize that it's not just about the science and engineering, it's about thinking about the market at the end of it.
Mm-hmm. Great. And actually, your answer is just leading to my next question. Yeah, because Chip Wall, your book is the best business book by Financial Times 2022. And people may think Chip Wall is a book about geopolitics and about technology. But actually, I think this is a great business book. And I learned a lot from that and the business decisions. Yeah, so if you can give advice to the business managers, how can they benefit from your book?
Well, I would say a couple of things. I think the first is that when you want to understand which technology products are the most successful, it's not always the most high-tech products that are the most successful. It's the most high-tech products that can be sold at a reasonable price, and ideally sold in large volumes. And to me, the first takeaway that I came to from writing about semiconductors is that technology is important and advanced production is important, but mass manufacturing and mass sales are equally important, perhaps more important. And when you look at the chip industry today, the difficulty is not so much in making 1 or 100 or 1,000 advanced chips. The difficulty is going from 1,000 to 100 million. And if you want to sell chips in an iPhone, for example, you need to make 100 million. And that mass manufacturing is extraordinarily complex. And the ability to devise that process is as much a process of supply chain management or of customer acquisition as it is about actually the technology of how to make chips. And so that was a really interesting takeaway, the challenge of mass manufacturing, the number of different facets that goes into that. And as a result of that, I came away thinking that entrepreneurs are very important, obviously. Technologists are very important, but we've underestimated the importance of supply chain managers and marketing managers and people whose focus is on the business side of technology companies. And so that was sort of the first big takeaway. I think the second takeaway was on the role of globalization. Because the chip industry, what I found is that it's been global since day one. The first semiconductors were invented in 1958, 1959, and then by 1963, the first assembly facilities were opened in other countries, in Hong Kong first, and then many other countries after that. And so the chip industry has been global basically from day one, and that's important as well because you can only get the scale both in terms of customer base and in terms of acquiring the best components and suppliers by having a international vision for the business from the earliest days. And today we think of globalization as being all around us and supply chains are international, but that wasn't the case 60 years ago. It was the chip industry that actually, I argue, made globalization possible. And if you want to understand how international businesses are structured today, actually, the history is the history of most sectors of the economy following the semiconductor industry in terms of opening production facilities and assembly in many different countries. And so that's the second key takeaway, is that we've kind of misunderstood globalization because we didn't fully realize the extent to which semiconductors made the globalization that we take for granted today.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. It's very interesting to hear you talk about this. And I think you are the first person to make the chip industry so sexy. I have to say that. Yeah, the way you talk about it. Because chip industry, we always think about that as a very rich. Yeah, they make a lot of money. Yeah, important. But you talk about that. It's fascinating. They can combine so many things together. Yeah, and I think you are absolutely right. And I'm so happy that you talk about the importance of the business side. And you also mentioned that in yesterday your event, during your speech, you think, we should value the business side even more. And now, and as you just say that, it seems that because of globalization seems a turning point. Yeah, same as the semiconductor industry. So we can talk about this more after this break. Welcome back to our podcast. And today I have a special guest, Dr. Miller. He is the author of the bestseller book, Chip War. And we just talked about the chip industry and the globalization. And it seems that it's come to a turning point. But first, I would like to ask Chris that when we prepare your event with Morris in March, and you told us that you hope more students can attend the event. And now people think the young generation do not read as much as before. And you are a professor. You teach the young generation. Why? Why they? I don't know. Your take. You think they read less, and what's the reason? And basically, I hope more people can read your book, especially younger generation, because this is their future. Yeah, you are a historian, but history is for us to learn from history, and we will have a better future. And but I can understand the young people may think that the geopolitics are too far away from us, and everything is done, and there's nothing more we can change. So can you share with us your view and why the young generation should read your book, or how can they benefit from your book?
Well, I guess one of the reasons I wrote the book was because I thought our discussion of technology in general was missing something really important. And when we think of technology today, we think of ChatGPT, or we think of social media, and that's obviously important and great. But it seemed to me we'd actually misunderstood how advanced technology is produced. And all of the world's biggest tech companies and all of the technology we use exists because of semiconductors, and we hadn't really thought very hard about how semiconductors are produced, the different factors that drive that, and as a result, we'd misunderstood actually how the world works. And that's fundamentally the claim of the book. Is if you want to understand tech, if you want to understand business, if you want to understand the geopolitical situation, you've got to put semiconductors at the center of your analysis. And I think when you start to do that, you understand the world in a much clearer way, because there are things that I didn't realize before I started the research, and that I think the book tries to help make clear is that the balance of economic influence, of military power, of tech firms' leadership all depends on semiconductors. And so I hope the book is useful because it actually helps you understand why the world functions in the way it does. And in particular, it opens up the tech sector to illustrate how actually it really works. Not just how it works technologically, but how business models depend on their access to the most advanced semiconductors, and how products that we rely on today exist thanks to their ability to use semiconductors in new ways. And as technology is going to increasingly define and reshape society, it's more important than ever, actually, that we have good explanations and understandings of what tech really is. It's social, it's economic, it's political bases. And so that to me is really the key takeaway from the book. And hopefully that's why it's useful to readers who are grappling with what does all this technology mean? What's the implications of it in the future? Well, you can only start to answer those questions if you understand how we got the technology that we rely on today.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, good. I think, I think that can help people to understand how important it is to realize that today. And back to the globalization question. And you are a historian, and history repeats itself. And from your book, we have seen that this is not the first time that the U.S. has defeated any competing countries come closer to them. We see that happen in Japan and now in China. And but we look at the history and hope we can foresee the future. And do you think the current U.S. restriction on the China's chip industry can get the similar result as before?
You know, it's impossible to look into the future with any clarity. But I think what we do see is that today China is heavily reliant on importing tools, software, chip designs, chemicals from abroad, from the US, from Japan, from Taiwan, from Korea, from the Netherlands. And the most advanced chips made in China today are made almost exclusively with imported tools from abroad, imported chemicals, imported software. And that's going to be, I think, very difficult for any country, but China included, to replicate its own supply chain. And what we're talking about is the most complex industry in the world, because there's nothing harder to manufacture than semiconductors, bar none. And if you look at the machines that are involved in manufacturing semiconductors, they're the most complex machines humans have ever made, with hundreds of thousands of components. If you take a lithography machine, they have the flattest mirrors humans have ever made, an explosion happening inside of them at 40 times hotter than the temperature of the surface of the sun. I mean, the engineering involved is just beyond comprehension, and that makes it difficult to replicate. That's why ASML in the Netherlands has 100% market share of certain types of lithography machines. That's why TSMC produces 90% of the most advanced processor chips, because it's really, really hard to do this type of thing. And the trend in the industry has actually, over the last decade, not been of countries catching up to the cutting edge, but countries falling behind the leader. So everyone has fallen behind the Netherlands in terms of lithography. Everyone has fallen behind TSMC in terms of fabricating advanced logic chips. It used to be the case that Japanese and European and US firms could produce at the level of TSMC. Now it's just TSMC and a little bit of Samsung slightly behind. So the trend has actually been everyone's falling behind the leader. And so for China to catch up, it has to do better than everyone else has done, while facing some pretty restrictive measures when it comes to their ability to import tools. And China's advanced producers today depend fundamentally on those imported tools. So, you know, nothing is impossible, and it's hard to predict where things will be in 10 years' time. But I think for the next 5 years, it'll be quite difficult for China to begin to replicate the really ultra-complex supply chains that exist and connect Europe, the US, Japan, and Taiwan. And the challenge is that China increasingly, if it wants to produce the cutting edge, has to replicate everything that those countries can do domestically. It just seems like a very difficult task for China to undertake in a short time span.
Mm-hmm. So I think this strategy can work at least for the 5 years, or
at least for some number of years. I think the answer is yes. I mean, the other aspect of the dynamic is that catching up in chips is hard, because unlike all other industries, chips progress very rapidly. So because of Moore's law, we get a doubling of computing power every 2 years. And no other industry moves anywhere close to that speed. Most industries, productivity improves at 3 or 4 or 5% a year, and that's seen as great. Whereas in semiconductors, we want 50% a year to get the performance increases that we need. And that's what makes it so hard to catch up, because the question is not, by 2033, can China catch up to where we are today? If China catches up to 2023 levels of technology in 2033, it'll be 5 Moore's laws behind the cutting edge. The question is, can China catch up to where the rest of the industry will be in a decade? Well, starting from a position of being behind and not being able to buy any of the tools that the rest of the industry will use in the meantime, it just seems like a very difficult race for China to win.
And just also said that the whole chip industry depends on several, quite a few key companies. And so in the 80s, we tried very hard to include ourselves, Taiwan, into the global supply chain. Yeah, and we think that can secure Taiwan. And I think we do this very successfully. And so I think the success become the challenge of Taiwan today. So do you have any advice for?
Well, I think that there's no doubt Taiwan's been extraordinarily successful at chip fabrication, companies like TSMC. It's also been pretty successful at chip design, MediaTek, for example, being one of the world's largest chip designers, especially if you look at firms outside the U.S., it's probably the largest chip designer outside the U.S. Today. So that's success right there. I think, if you ask yourself, can Taiwan be even more successful in semiconductors? It's hard when we've already been very successful to get even more successful. And so it seems to me the challenge for Taiwan is to retain its success in semiconductors while also becoming more successful in other spheres to balance out Taiwanese industry. And when you look across the tech sector, what you find is that there's a lot of different segments of the tech sector that are enabled by semiconductors, where Taiwan, I think, probably has competitive advantages given its very skilled workforce in these sectors, and given that it's got a semiconductor industry to build on, so software design, so electric vehicles, biotechnology, all seem like spheres where over the next decade or two, Taiwan could play a very big role building on its success in semiconductors, but applying that expertise to different segments. It's always the case that when countries have a very successful industry, they try to focus on protecting that industry, and that's a understandable response, but it's probably the case that if you've got a successful industry, they're pretty good at protecting themselves. And actually, the focus should be on building up other industries to be just as successful.
I think our case is the other way around. Yeah, the successful industry protect us. That's what we call that silicon shield. Do you think that work?
I think that the history shows that Taiwan has been protected by its friends since before the first semiconductor was invented. The U.S. and Taiwan were collectively defending Taiwan in the 1950s before chips existed. And if you look at why the U.S. is interested in continuing to help Taiwan protect itself today, it's far from semiconductors that are the primary reason. There are lots of different interests that unite the U.S. and Taiwan. A shared sense of values also bring the two together. And so I think in Taiwan, there's a strong belief that semiconductors are the reason the rest of the world is interested in Taiwan. And I think that's a real overstatement. I think, in fact, there are lots of reasons why Taiwan is important for political, for economic, for diplomatic, et cetera, reasons. And it's wrong to think that semiconductors are the sole reason why the rest of the world is interested in Taiwan or is helping to protect Taiwan.
Mm-hmm. I think you are right, and I hope you are right. Okay, my last question is from a publisher. So do you have another book project in your mind? I think you do, because you already have 3 books on Russia and 1 book on chip war.
Well, I don't have another book that I'm starting to write. I think there's a couple of industries that I think are really interesting that I'm trying to learn more about. One is biotechnology, where there's lots of fascinating developments underway right now, and the application of computing and AI to biotechnology is really going to be transformative in the next couple of decades, I think. The second is looking at how electric vehicles are changing the auto industry. For most of the last several decades, there's been just a couple of countries that have dominated auto production: Japan, Germany, U.S. And electric vehicles are going to change everything. The supply chains will be different. The technology involved is different. So the companies involved will be different too. And I think there'll be a reshuffling of the map when it comes to that industry as well, which is also really interesting to think about its business, its economic, its political consequences. I guess the third question that I'm trying to understand is how, Morris Chang and I had this debate about whether globalization is dead. And I think he says it's almost dead. I think he's wrong. But I think the right way to say it is that globalization is changing in important ways. We're seeing a splitting of the tech sector between China its neighbors and the rest of the world. And so understanding how do we explain the ways that globalization is changing is going to be really important. And what's the role played by existing players that today are very integrated with many other trading partners? How is their trade going to shift? What's the impact on countries like India, which today are not actually that integrated into global manufacturing supply chains? Will they become more integrated in the future? That's, I think, a key question, which is actually really important for Taiwan, because Taiwan is really at the center of the world's manufacturing networks. And if you look at manufacturing in China, it's often Taiwanese firms that are supplying critical components or doing the manufacturing. And so the shifts in manufacturing will both be shaped by Taiwan, because Taiwan's such a critical player, but also have a big impact on Taiwan. And so understanding those shifts will be critical, I think, to understanding what the world economy looks like in 10 or 20 years' time. And when I say that Morris Chang is wrong to say we're deglobalizing, it seems implausible to me that we're going to have a lot less trade in the future, just because different countries have different specialties and they'll need to exchange. But I think it's certainly the case that the structure, the shape of globalization is going to shift. And understanding those shifts, I think, is a very difficult task, but also a critical task to understanding how the world is going to work.
I think all those topics are very interesting and important topics. And I think the globalization topic is more urgent, I think. And maybe you have to think about a new term for the changing globalization. And that will be more accessible to the catching.
Well, if I think of a new term, I'll write a new book about it.
Okay. Thank you, Chris. So thank you for making time to do the podcast, and hope you can come to Taiwan again in the near future.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much for having me.
Thank you.